What a pleasure to have you all. Thank you for making the walk to Bolívar House. It was a big day. Today's lecture is entitled US-Cuba Relations Before and After a Watershed Election by Tinker Visiting Professor Ernesto Dominguez Lopez from Universidad de La Habana. This lecture is being co-sponsored by the Department of History and the Cuba Observatory. Thank you, Professor Dominguez, for joining us today. For those joining us on the live stream, please submit any questions or comments via the YouTube chat section. Kindly note, closed captioning for the live stream video will be provided in the coming days. Now, Professor Michael Wolf will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
That's for our guest. Yes, hi, I'm Michael Wolf. I'm Associate Professor of History here, Director of Graduate Studies at CLES, and Director of the Cuba Observatory. So I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Ernesto Dominguez today, whose talk, as Hector said, is co-sponsored by CLES and the Cuba Observatory. I didn't actually know if it's co-sponsored by History, but that'd be great. Professor Dominguez, he's a professor of history and political sciences at the Center of Hemispheric and United States Studies at the University of Havana, Cuba. Very interesting center there that studies the United States, which has had a profound impact on Cuba, as you can imagine, and we'll talk about today. He's published widely on the history and politics of US-Cuban relations, US politics, international relations, political theory, and theory of history. He's held visiting positions at universities and other academic institutions in the United States and Europe. And he's currently our Edward Larocq Tinker Visiting Professor here. And he's also been Honorary Visiting Professor at the University of Buckingham in the UK and Visiting Professor at the University of Sancti Spiritus in Cuba. He has far too many publications for me to mention, but here's one I'd like to highlight. One that just came out, Cuba in the Multipolar World Order. We happen to have a co-author chapter in it. So yes, tooting my own home. On a personal note, Ernesto is a dear friend, colleague, and interlocutor. It was my honor to nominate him to serve as a Tinker Visiting Professor this year, and an integral member of the Cuba Observatory, whose goal is to show that normalization of relations between the US and Cuba is possible and is mainly a matter of political will in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, that's been lacking under Biden and is not likely to change under Trump. But there's no one better than Ernesto to enlighten us about this topic today, so I hand it over to him without further ado.
Thank you. I'm actually very happy to be here. I'm really glad to have this opportunity to talk to you guys, and I'm really thankful for you to have come today. I think I'm gonna enjoy this conversation because I will be presenting for about, I don't know, 45, 50 minutes, that's my idea, but I'm actually looking forward to the Q&A afterwards. That's the best part. So I hope you find this interesting. In fact, this topic is, I would say, a rather important topic to understand the realities of the Western Hemisphere, of Cuba, of the United States, and beyond. This is just a few books that we have published in the last few years. These are just projects in which I have been involved in one way or another. In Cuba, the United States, Mexico, and Germany, actually Switzerland, although the project is actually with Germany, but it was published in Switzerland. So it's just showing you how these have enticed the interest, has attracted the attention of more than just Cuba and the United States. It is an extremely complicated reality that we have to address here. And as a historian, I have to look at it beginning by knowing where it came from and how it evolved over time, because it's not something that was set in stone sometime and remain like that forever. But then we're going to look into how US policies are made. That's the political science part of it. And then we're going to look into what happened since the revolution, and especially during the 21st century, to have an idea of what may or may not happen in the near future or beyond the near future. So the long history of this relationship is actually connected to this realities, the realities of colony, of neocolonization, and of empire. And that is extremely important. We need to understand, as I was saying, that it was not something that just emerged at some point that remained unchanged. It has evolved as much as Cuban society, American society, regional societies, and the world have evolved. We have to look at it from the lenses of history as something that is always in the move, as something, a reality that is always changing, is evolving, right? So, how this relationship came to be? One very important component is to understand the increasing economic interest in the United States in particular, but not only in the United States, the increasing economic interest among American business persons, elites, in advancing their presence in Cuba, especially at the time in which, around the 19th century, I know people that are very much into the 19th century, in which the Cuban economy was growing very fast due to the sugar industry. That also made a large number, or a significant proportion of those who owned the Cuban industry in Cuba to be interested in selling that sugar in the United States, those creating sort of a symbiotic relationship between the elites in the two countries. But that's not the only factor. That economic interest evolved into, I'm going very quickly on this because I cannot get into details, but evolved into a full economic dependency all the way up to 1958. This actually started while Cuba was still Spanish colony. But just to give you an idea how important or how dependent Cuba was on the United States, by 1958, up to 90% of the revenue that Cuba generated from its foreign sector, from foreign trade, was with the United States, was from selling stuff to the United States. And 90% of that came from selling sugar, in particular. So hugely dependent economy, hugely dependent, reliant on just one product. It's a fairly typical reality for many countries, especially in the Latin American, Central America, the Caribbean, and other somewhat medium-sized small countries. That also entail a two-way migratory process. Typically, we look at this thinking, oh, Cubans immigrating into the United States. Sure, that has happened. In fact, there is presence of Cubans, legal presence of Cubans under the figure of legal permanent residence since the earlier records that we have available. The earliest we know that the earliest records come out from 1820. Legal permanent residence in the United States. And there were already Cubans in that number. So there have been Cubans coming here for many, many years. But there have been also a number of Americans going to Cuba, especially business persons, but at some point, some people that try to colonize the country. The southernmost, the second largest island of the Cuban archipelago, for example, is La de Pinos, a number of them that went there, or in some sugar factories, there were a number of Americans who moved there, and so on and so forth. And of course, they included a form of circular migration, people coming to the United States for business and to study or to get some jobs for a few years to make some money and bring it back to Cuba, and Americans doing somewhat similar stuff when going to Cuba. So there is a very dynamic connection that have been going on for many years, even during the last 60 plus years, that we're gonna get deeper on those. There have been always some circulation of people coming back and forth between the two countries. Sometimes a very, very limited numbers due to other reasons, but they have been a reality ever since. This has translated into a wide array of cultural influences across relations. I just want to point to a few. Baseball is the first one, not just out of randomness, not just because I love baseball and sports in general, it's because it was one of the most visible aspects of this cultural influence. That's why we have the best ball players in the world, better than Americans and anybody else's, obviously. But it also goes to every other aspect, from the times in which we eat to the way in which our cities was built or expanded for many years, and how this has impacted education, so on and so forth. And there have been also significant presence of Cubans in some areas in the United States that have been relevant for the development of those areas. And of course, everybody knows Miami right now. Well, I guess everybody knows Miami. but there were significant Cuban community in New York in the 1800s, in Tampa, in Key West, that were very important, particularly those in Tampa and Key West, for the development of those cities and those local economies, right? So we have this, they have been going on for centuries now. However, it is not a nice relationship in the sense, oh, we get along very well, all of that. No, it actually has evolved into something way more complicated than just two neighbors getting along. Among other things, because since the very beginning, even before the United States was founded as a state, as a nation, there were stated interests among American elites, the American elites to be the founding fathers even, in acquiring Cuba. There was, I think, it was Thomas Jefferson said at some point, the most incorporation or acquisition for the new republic is Cuba, stuff like that. People saying that Cuba was formed by dirt dragged by the Mississippi River and therefore it's American, so on and so forth. Some of them were saying that acquiring Cuba or the British controlling Cuba was indispensable for the survival of the new republic. So we have that, and there are records of that, written records. You can actually find very easily. There's a whole book by Lou Perez Jr., historian for Chapel Hill, talking about Cuban and American imagination and how across many years the idea of Cuba and Cuba representing the United States evolved to become whatever it is today. It's a very, very hard to read, by the way, but a very important book, if I say so. There were several attempts to buy Cuba from Spain, much like it was happening elsewhere. They offered up to $300 million at the time. That was a huge amount of money. I think the Louisiana territory was about 15 million, I think. Somewhere around that, Louisiana, which is, I mean, the valley of the Mississippi River. Cuba, about doubling the territory of the United States overnight, and Cuba, actually, they offer up to 20 times more for Cuba. So just to demonstrate how interesting it was, we need to understand that this was going on as the United States was expanding, because we need to think not of the United States as it is today. The United States was founded in the East Coast and then began expanding to the West and to the South through different means, buying territories and conquering territories. Okay, so this is the setting. In fact, during the first Cuban Independence War, the United States supported Spain. This is just right after the American Civil War. The US was not strong enough as to, at the very least, had a saying in whatever would happen with Cuba afterwards. It was better from that perspective, but the idea of acquiring Cuba to give it on to Spain to see what would happen next. That's why the Cuban independence wars eventually ended with an American intervention, which is part of the broader Spanish Cuban Filipino, because there were people fighting in both countries. That's typically not included in this American war. Why is this war so important? Because the 1898 war is a watershed moment, one of those inflection points in history. This is the launch of the United States as a modern empire. I have to be very clear about it. It's launching the United States as a modern empire, not a traditional European empire, but a modern version of those empires. And this is extremely important. After this, the United States expanded beyond its immediate surroundings, acquiring overseas territories in the Caribbean and in Asia. By the way, targeting China. This led to the creation of a protectorate in Cuba. A protectorate meaning a form of colony, in which there is a legal cession of sovereignty to the protector in exchange for protection from potential threats from abroad. The definition is a little bit more precise than that, but the whole idea is that. And that meant that all the way to, we're going to see 1930s, Cuba went from being a Spanish colony to an American protectorate, which I will say an American colony. Later, when that legal framework was repealed, that protectorate was replaced by a neo-colony. So the United States kept, and remember that I what I pointed out earlier, economic dependence all the way through. But this legal framework was eliminated, was abolished, but the United States government retained political control, but through indirect means, like using local proxies, mostly the military and a number of politicians. That is the very definition of a neo-colony and a very common thing in Latin America, even the United States and Latin America. That's actually a fact. So this is what that protectorate and the neo-colony looked like in terms of some sequence of events that show how it operated, from the military interventions to the treaties that established those dependencies, to the employment of military leaders, put it that way, who actually led military coups and seized power in Cuba to use it as a way to control the island in different moments. The name that comes from here is actually Fulgencio Batista, who led, except for one, all the military coups in Cuban history. And in the first one, he was part of it. I was in 1933, but then in 1934, 1936, and 1952, he led those other three. And by the way, you know what base is this one that I'm mentioning here? This is Guantanamo. So it came from all of this. It came from here all the way to be included here to when this was, these treaties were repealed and the Parliament was repealed, but they signed a new treaty to keep the base on board. They have been paying for years, sending checks for about $2,000 per year. That Cuba hasn't collected, by the way. They're kept somewhere to exhibit in a museum after the fact. That's the whole idea, to exhibit in the museum when the territory is given back. So why this interest? Why will the United States, being such a large, big, powerful, wealthy country, be interested in small country in the Caribbean? Why? Well, I already mentioned the economic interest. So it's mainly the sugar industry, sure. There was also a couple of steps. Mining companies and some companies willing to export to Cuba. These economic treaties, the treaties were actually given to American companies. Open room in Cuba, very low tariff, if at all. So they essentially control Cuban domestic markets. Not a large market, but still for some companies it was important. And control utilities in Cuba, etc. So you have a spectrum of interest in Cuba. But more important than that, probably, or at the least as important, I would say even more important, it is the geopolitical dimension of that interest. Which, of course, first and foremost, Cuba's geographical location. I'm going to show, it's not just words. Because we are connected to the Gulf of Mexico that may be renamed the Gulf of America. It is floating out there, so I have to consider it. I don't like it either, if I'm being honest. But, and also, another thing that has become important or relevant or known again, the Panama Canal is deeply connected to these two things. Why? Because Cuba is just right here, just at the very entrance of the Gulf of Mexico, with all these important ports and the Mississippi River, which is extremely important historically, but also right now the oil fields and the oil producing areas in the Gulf, and also just north of the Panama Canal. That when we change for taking a look at the trade routes in the region and in the world, I think it's very clear that Cuba is too well located for our own sake. Because it's not only the US. Many, I would say all major powers have at one point or the other for the last 500 years, being interested in Cuba to some extent due to this very reason. So that means that the foundation of the relationship between the two countries includes an important contradiction. What is that contradiction? Two, I would say, largely incompatible national projects in the way in which they have evolved for the last couple of hundred years or so. On the American side, is empire building. I'm not saying that each person in the United States, I'm saying that the general orientation of US foreign policy has been to building an empire, expanding first, territorially speaking, and then increasing influence worldwide, using the military, using economic tools, using other forms of influence. Until today, there is a debate about the American leadership, the idea that the US should lead the world. That's what it is. This is just a more clear, historically accurate way, in my view, to represent that in terms of the national project. Versus the Cuban perspective, which is trying to build a nation in Cuba and build itself as a sovereign nation of that. And being where Cuba is, these two projects cannot coexist in the same area for as long as both remain active. You cannot be sovereign if you're in the middle of an empire that is trying to expand or trying to protect its interests in the region. So, on that base, how is a Cuban policy made? I'm gonna go over this quickly. Just gonna point to a couple of things. Some of you have seen this step. This is essentially how the policy is made. It doesn't matter which part of government. Don't pay too much attention to the cycle here. That is just a model. But I just want to point to a couple of things. There is a number of non-governmental actors that are heavily influential in government. This means powerful elites. The power elites, according to C. Wright Mills, talking about the power elites. This is what it looks like. People influencing the policymaking process, interest groups, some specific communities that may have an influence, thinking about the Cuban American elites in particular and how they have been part of this. But importantly, this is all contained and constrained by what is called a state policy, meaning an overarching goal for every policy, any policy that the government makes regarding one issue, one topic. In any issue, there will be, at any given time, this kind of overarching state policy. You name it, whatever it is. And then every policy that is made, which this state policy is essentially a function of the fundamental consensus among the elites, what all of those elites want fundamentally, even when there are variations of that. So the competition is not about what is the ultimate goal, it's about how to achieve that goal, or who will benefit the most from that. In the case of Cuba, I think it's very clear that the state policy is oriented at initially gaining control in Cuba, later keeping that control, and more recently recovering that control. And everything that I've seen so far derives from that, or is largely influenced by that. This has to do with those who make the decisions, how they make those decisions. I just want to point out that it also includes how able are they, and this is individuals and groups, to assess everything else. What benefits them most, what serves their interest or not, the conditions, etc., etc. So, that being said, for the specific case of Cuba, the Cuba policy, there is at the least three sets of variables that we need to consider. Structural variables is essentially what I already have touched upon, which is geopolitical interest, these national policies, etc., which define these foundations for the state policy. Those are variables, those things change, but change very slowly. When compared to what is going on in Cuba, in the world, in the region, which is the contextual variables, and what is going on within the United States itself. Who is in government? What group power groups has more power in this context? For example, the new administration that is starting on Monday, just a reminder, represents a set of those American elites that has spoken very clearly about what they intend. That has to be considered when we are trying to understand how it works and what's the future of this. So then, what are the foundations of U.S. policy then, U.S. foreign policy in general, and how this applies to Cuba? There is a couple of foundational documents, one of which is an official document, and another one is more like an ideological work. But when you have the two, you have a very good idea of the general projection of the United States in the initial time, which for Cuba, by the way, it included this, the theory of the ripe fruit, by the same guy. Let me say, according to this idea, Cuba will be on the United States regardless. It's a law of nature. You can actually look for it. This is in the speeches and in the. This was presented by James Monroe in one of the State of the Union, well, the early version of the State of the Union speeches. It is quite interesting, if you ask me. So, with that in mind, what do you think the Cuban Revolution of 1959 meant for the United States, and how could that have affected the relationship between the two countries? It's very clear that a revolution that is starting to change things will not be received kindly. This, by the way, this is when the Barbudos entered Havana. This is actually a very famous picture of Fidel Castro and Camilo Cienfuegos and all of that. What was the revolution of 1959? Or the revolution that triumphed in 1959? Because it started before. It started, I'm going to touch on that, reacting to a few things. Why the revolution to begin with? Well, there's a number of reasons. You can actually point to it, but these are probably the main ones, which is the level of social inequality in Cuba. For sure, there was a significant level of inequality in Cuba that people was reacting to that. There were attempts to reform the Cuban society and its politics all the way into the 1930s that effectively were prevented from happening, quite often manually, and more recently, Batista's dictatorship that stopped any possibility of reforming the country in a pacific way, in a peaceful way. Of course, very important, all of this while the country had still a very limited form of sovereignty, if at all. When you combine this, using this dictatorship largely as a trigger for the expression of accumulated grievances and demands, you will have the revolution. Pretty much like any revolution, it was a function of accumulated grievances, the idea of breaking with whatever was existent, and often triggered by something specific, in this case, the dictatorship and what it represents. The struggle against the dictatorship started in 1953, just a year after it was established. So it was very soon after. It was a political revolution, and by the way, this is very much connected to the classes, because it, in fact, rebuilt the whole state. It was not just simply taking someone out of government and putting somebody else's new. It was actually changing the whole thing, the whole political system, the way in which the government operated, and eventually having new constitutions. The initial one that was started in 1941 was largely expanded and changed by the fundamental law of 1959, and then the Constitution in 1976, and then another version or a modification of the Constitution in 1992, and the most recent one in 2019. Yeah, our constitutional history is a little bit dynamic. It's not like the American version, which is actually very few things going on over time. In our case, quite a bunch of those. That's actually fairly common in Latin America as well. And of course, it included a certain sovereignty, reclaiming sovereignty. That is already a problem in the context of the relationship with the United States. But it also included a very important social revolution, was a political and social revolution that initially was mostly about these things. Not necessarily at the same time, because this was the first one, the first major change, the land reform, and then was looking at the urban areas and lowering the rent prices, and then creating the conditions for literacy campaign. Well, because in fact, the literacy campaign happened in 1961, but it had started before with more local, more limited efforts to teach people how to read and write. There was about 1 million, give or take, literate people in Cuba at the time, out of 6 million population, roughly. So this was already something that was changing Cuban society. When you combine both of them, the United States, which by the way, this is Richard Nixon, this is Fulgencio Batista, and they are laughing amicably in late 1950s. The United States will not take this hand, as I said. 1959, by the way, Fidel visited privately the United States and met with Richard Nixon. President Eisenhower didn't receive him. He went to play golf because he didn't want this to be an official visit, because that would mean a recognition of the legitimacy of the government. And initially, the idea, well, this is just another change of government. The US actually said, okay, but this is no longer useful. But this initial context and what was going on in Cuba told them otherwise, told these people in government otherwise, and that generated rejection and hostility in the American government. In fact, after this meeting, there are accounts of the meeting, and William Leograndes and Peter Combrut book about Back Channel to Cuba. There is actually accounts of all of this, and they said that they told how Nixon tried to school Fidel and told him what to do in Cuba. That wouldn't be well received by Fidel himself. And then he went to Eisenhower and said, "This is not the man we want for Cuba." So, why this hostility? I think we already have a good idea why. There is I will point out to 4 reasons. You can expand on this. The first is that, in fact, the Cuban Revolution, being a revolution that was trying to reclaim Cuban sovereignty, damaged the power structure that US had created in the Western Hemisphere. Obviously, there is one part of that, one piece of the puzzle that is suddenly missing. Of course, there were the companies that lost property in Cuba. The first one, the biggest one with the Larocq already, was United Fruit Company, which at the time was very well known in all of Central America, and was in the business of putting governments, taking governments down, controlling countries, especially Guatemala, Honduras, United, also in Cuba. So they will not be happy with this. You have to include that this happened in the midst of the Cold War. So if this change was also perceived as a threat for the United States in this global conflict with the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. And that also has, of course, a very strong ideological component. There's a rejection of anything that could be framed as communist. This speech of communism and all of that was often used to justify things, but also it expressed this very strong ideological bias against anything that was slightly different. It will be framed as communist, even if they were not. The Cuban Revolution didn't start as a correction, as a socialist revolution. It started as a national revolution that wanted to transform the country mostly in what I would say a social democratic kind of sense. But it evolved into something different, more radical, largely because from the very beginning, this is the essence of US reaction. This is a memorandum that served as the foundation of US when there was Cuba after 1959. There is the link down there if you want to look at it. But I just want to take a look at this part. The only foreseeable means of international support is through disenchantment of affection based on economic satisfaction and hardship. And then we are going to have to take any available measure to make that happen. This is 1960. 1960. Keep that in mind. In actually early 1960. Keep that in mind. So this essentially triggers what I call a back and forth. Economic sanctions, US reacts and nationalizes some American property. US imposed more sanctions on Cuba. Cuba further nationalized not only American property, but also the large property in the island or in the country. US breaks the, this is not exactly, the sequence is mostly that. There are some variations. There's some variation. Broke the relations, supported anti-government guerrillas, which is the so-called in Cuba bandidos, organized a proxy invasion by the CIA, the famous Bay of Pigs, typically considered the biggest fiasco in CIA history, by some at the very least. That led to Cuba, and that process led to Cuba to establishing some kind of the Soviet Union as a way to try to compensate for whatever loss. Because remember how important the economic relation with the United States was. And these economic sanctions meant that the United States was essentially cutting its ties with Cuba, economic ties. Cuba was left hanging. I don't know, the colgado la brocha, we said that in Cuban Spanish. That was an alternative to protect from that. And that, of course, also had an influence on the way in which the country evolved. In 1962, it was formalized. And I'm using this expression because if you follow me, it was actually on the making since 1959 onwards. In 1962, February 1962, President Kennedy signed the Presidential Proclamation 3447 that established officially what is called in the United States the embargo, and that is called in Cuba the blockade. Why? Because it's interpreted as an act of economic war. Whereas embargo has a softer look to it. Also, of course, that led to Cuba getting deeper in connection with the Soviet Union and establishing an alliance. The point is, this back and forth, at the very least, quickened the pace of the radicalization of the Cuban Revolution. At the very least. These are just a couple of pictures of some events, but pigs. Some of the that's one of the biggest one. Actually, this picture is in the most famous picture by Chase, actually, in the public gathering that came after this, talking about the public meeting in Havana after this happened. There are some of the alzados. One of the stores in Havana was burned and destroyed in the process, and the invaders who surrendered in Bay of Pigs. So what we're talking here is about full-fledged conflict. That's what we're talking about. A conflict that has to do with this spread through this economic warfare that had a very one of the high points of this was, of course, the missile crisis. The missile crisis that also, in the process, the U.S. worked for the political isolation of Cuba. In the 1960s, actually, all Latin American countries, except for Mexico, broke the relations with Cuba, and they also started from OAS in 1963. In this particular context, not to mention, it's not to plug in our chapter, but there was a significant weaponization of disaster in Cuba by trying to pile on those disasters, negating assistance and trying to prevent any assistance from getting to Cuba and trying to use them to generate discontent, et cetera, et cetera. I just mentioned in this one because it's probably the biggest disaster in the early times, although there are quite a few other cases. Interested, you can read the chapter that we have in the book that you mentioned earlier. There were always plans for that invasion. Even when Kennedy promised not to invade Cuba as part of the solution for the missile crisis, which in Cuba they were called the crisis of October crisis, there were always these plans. And then we have the first military crisis. This is what completed the migration of most of Cuban elites and upper middle classes and middle classes to the United States, and the formation of the Cuban American community in Miami. The one in Miami came from this process. Of course, Cuba and on the side lended support for revolutionary liberation movements in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. It is not Che Bolivia in Africa, but the support for the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, or essentially the FARC in Colombia, for example, for a long, long time, to support for Angola and other movements, and also support for Vietnam during the war with the United States, by the way. Cuba even offered sending troops to Vietnam, which sounds crazy, but there were a number of attempts to solve this, a number of contacts ongoing. Jimmy Carter actually went further than anybody else's. And in some areas, I think that he moved the poll actually further than Obama did in his own conditions. I mean, each one in their context. He actually was the one who restored some degree of diplomatic relations and opened the possibility of dialogue, but also dialogue between the Cuban and segments of the Cuban immigration. The dialoguero. This guy suffered a lot of attacks in Miami, by the way, like many. But quite a few things happened late in his tenure, and hey, there we went again, back into conflict, including all the crises around the world and Mariel will leave, the second major wave of migration from Cuba. So, in the 1990s, 1989 was, of course, 1989, 1991 is a major geopolitical shift worldwide. I will call it a political earthquake that triggered this crisis in Cuba that we still, in many ways, we haven't totally overcome. And we actually have gotten deeper in the crisis due to a number of other reasons. But it started here when this disappeared. Or it's not only about these 85%. It's about whatever it represents in terms of technology support, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then we had the United States doubling down at the time in which the United States was normalizing relations with China and Vietnam, lifting sanctions in 1994. The United States was first passing the Torricelli Act, which made significant part of the blockade into law and added on top of the existing regulations. And then in 1996, tripled down with the Helms-Burton Act that established conditions like once Cuba have free elections the way we want, then we're gonna think about maybe perhaps it's possible that we leave the sanctions. No, it doesn't say that when this happens, it's gonna happen. It says when this happens, then we're gonna evaluate and decide what to do. And of course, you have sanctions for certain country-based companies. The Title III of this law was suspended from the beginning, but then restored by Trump, and then now suspended by Biden. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And they started using blacklistings in 1997. So that's including entities, individuals, vessels in OFAC's blacklist. Essentially, it's trying to kill every form of international trade, every form of international economic partnership that Cuba may build. And that's how we made it, if you are not, to the 21st century. What happened in the 21st century? We have to consider a few global trends that I will just put it there for you to take a look. We're talking about the massive change worldwide. Very much connected to this. And of course, leading largely to this. That means that compartment that we're talking about, and that when Cuba entering that sphere was on the rise, now we are talking about a Cuba still not part of our structure, but an empire or a power in decline when in global standing. That doesn't mean there's not a huge power. I'm talking about rapid decline and lashing out and trying to rebuild that power structure as much as it can. Again, none of you that is an American citizen probably is interested in any of this. I mean, I'm talking about building an empire or controlling somebody else's whatever. This is about elites willing to control parts of the world because it serves their interests. which, by the way, is very well known in Cuba. It was part of my education growing up. Our conflict is with the United States government. It's not with the US people, for example. Let alone somebody from some other place, which are many here. So, what was Cuba doing when this global trend has been Cuba for the last 25 years? Well, we have been involved in a long process of economic, social, and political reforms. There is in Cuba, there's a huge debate ongoing about these reforms. Are they going far enough? They're not going far enough. They're going too far. Are they going too slow? Are they going too quickly? What this means, what this means for the given society, all of that. There have been a change from government and even a constitutional change in 2019, I also already mentioned. There have been a significant increase in immigration due to the accumulated economic hardships and all the complexity in society and all the social implications. And there have been a significant increase in social inequality due to the combination of the impact of the blockade and some of the economic reforms that have led to the formation of, for example, an emerging capitalist class in Cuba. That in itself is creating inequalities. And then there are regional inequalities and all of that. And that is actually bringing back some form of inequality that were not completely absent, but were not as huge as they are now, in terms of race or skin color, gender, etc., etc. Not that they didn't exist, but they have been significantly reduced by the revolution itself, by the way in which it evolved. This is bringing a lot of that back, thus creating different forms of conflict within the Cuban society. And then, as everybody else says, COVID. But there is a couple of things that we have, not good ones, that others don't, very much connected to this level of economic instability. When I'm talking about economic instability, that's what I'm talking about. That is the role of Cuban's GDP for about 24 years, all the way to 2021. Is, the chart. This is COVID-19, the impact of COVID. Huge dip. So, of course, the US offered to help and gave a lot of things and a lot of money to give, right? Wrong. Because, of course, what the United States during this Ford administration did was George W. Bush was adding pressure on Cuba. How? Banning new things. You might think impossible, but adding new things to the list of prohibited items for Cuba, from using dollars all the way to whatever you want, including creating a special office that will be in charge of managing transition in Cuba. Kelly McCarry was actually appointed for that office. A commission chaired by the Secretary of State and Secretary of Commerce. These include Colin Powell, Condi Rice, and Carlos Gutierrez, chairing or co-chairing that committee that will be in charge of that transition in Cuba, advancing that transition in Cuba. And largely, remember that Bush was elected largely because of Florida. And the Cuban Americans are very influential in Florida. And he had about 80% of the Cuban votes. After a very important case, the case of a kid, Julian Gonzalez, triggered the community, also triggered, by the way. So he continued adding pressure on Cuba. And then Obama came. I said, okay, let's soften this a little bit, and eventually announce a change of policy. What was that change of policy? Lifting or softening some sanctions, effectively taking Cuba out of the list of countries that sponsor terrorism, which is a big part of that, but everything else remained in place. And this is also important to understand. The core of the relationship, the sanctions, the blockade itself remained largely untouched. Something in the margins via executive action was done. Important, good, better. but insufficient to change the nature of the relationship itself and the orientation of US policy. Well, should I say anything else? I'm going to show you something else in a minute. And Biden, what did until a week ago, literally a week ago, was to keep going in this way. Just keep going, just fighting. Part of this policy is connected to this support for opposition groups or dissident groups. Some that are created in the process, created by the US itself, as whoever is in charge of that. And just a few ones of them, but also, for example, funding alternative media platforms and the media groups. This is social engineering. This is attempt to apply social engineering, meaning trying to modify behaviors and belief among the population to lead them to change their political views and lead them mobilize against the government. Not only against the government. This is important to understand. It's not only against the government. It's against the social system, the socio-economic system at large. Opposition within the United States is essentially wanting one form of capitalism or other, whereas in Cuba is mostly wanting something that we can call socialism, or position is wanting to have capitalism and ending every long-term effect of the revolution. So it's a more fundamental kind of position, the one that we're talking about. But the problem is this. This is about media platforms and groups. This is just 1 year. USAID alone, there is also National Endowment for Democracy, which is channeling money which is allocated by Congress for to fund programs for the support of democracy in Cuba, 20-30 million every year. Goes through these agencies. And you may see some of the wording of the aims of those. Because the wording is important. It's not just to monitor something, just to explore this. It's in some cases about denouncing things. So you have to find it. Otherwise, you're going to lose your fund. So that's also important. Many people here in Cuba are actually getting their information from these sources. And this is important to understand. I'm not saying that everything they say is wrong or reliable, whatever. I'm saying they are biased. And they are biased in a very clear way. And there is reason for that bias. But then the big, what they call the elephant in the room, always in case of Cuba, is the blockade. This is just a breakdown by year of new sanctions, or sanctions that are either new or renovated or modified all the way since the 1970s to 2023. Blue lines are sanctions, the red lines are flexibilizations, meaning taking somebody out of the list or modifying, softening some of the regulations. Right? This is actually a student of my wife's student, and some of the work before is with her. So this is actually what her work. She's coming soon, so I have to be good about it. I have to mention her. So as you see, there is very clear prevalence of sanctions, and this is on top of existing long-standing regulations like Torricelli, Helms-Burton, the Cuban Asset Control Regulation from 1963. On top of that, we have these things. And this is Obama, sure. And then who this is? And can you see the years? 2019, 2020, in the midst of the pandemic, Trump added 17 new regulations, including up to 400 Cuban economic entities in the blacklist, for example, in the midst of the pandemic, including those who were in charge of being the counterpart in Cuba of Western Union in sending remittances that are very important for the Cuban people in a context in which they could not just go and give the money out of the pockets to the family friends. They could just not travel because it's in the midst of the pandemic. So it was a double blow for Cuba. By the way, this is just a common behavior in the United States for the last 20 plus years. This is worldwide. The use of economic sanctions by the United States, the increased use of economic sanctions. And this is what that creates: scarcity, shortages of essentially everything, forcing people to queue for hours and hours to get something. It varies. It's not always the same. There have been a number of the mechanisms have been put in place and have operated for some time, trying to compensate for this, but then they are typically overwhelmed by the demand. And there are moments in which, for example, right now, as we speak, there is a very important lack of capacity to generate electricity in Cuba due to the oil gas issues and lack of fuel. And there is a shortage of fuel in general, as we speak. Talking about rolling blackouts, much like happened in Puerto Rico, for example, and a few other places. In our case, due largely fundamental to the long-term and the deep impact of the blockade. And that correlates directly to this: mass migration. This is by fiscal years. This is the most recent one. This is 2024. So the total figure here is nearly 700,000. Cuba is 11 million people, roughly speaking. Now it's actually more like 10 million because of this. 700,000 people in just 4 years. Of course, not everybody who's here came straight from Cuba. So they were elsewhere and then came here. Most of them leave the country legally. They travel to let's say, Mexico or Central America, and they take the land route to the United States, and then they became illegal when they went to the United States, or in the process, not coming out of Cuba. That's also important because these people didn't swim here, and the sea route by craft or whatever is no longer the main one. It was the main one for a few years, not anymore. Not and for a long time. So, November 5th, 2024. Nothing relevant happened that day, right? Nothing relevant. What will follow? This will be probably where I will end what I will say, but today I have to do something else. Because in the last couple of months, there have been a few little things that came up. This future administration includes a couple of number of names very much set against the Cuban government, the Cuban people. With, little Marco, as Trump called him. It's not me, this is Trump. Okay, little Marco. And Mauricio, which probably is not as well known, but it's probably more influential, at the time. This guy was largely in charge of Cuba in the State Department when he was there. Then went to the Inter-American Bank of Development, and then now he's back in the State Department, will be back in the State Department. Was part of Trump's transition team in 2016, 2017. So he's very well connected with the administration, with the powerhouse, with the administration. And of course, you know that there is a number of new Americans that have been growing in Congress. Some of them are very notable, like, Marco Rubio himself, Ted Cruz, but I know people that are good friends with Ted Cruz. And then there is a few, especially in the House, that are very outspoken about this. Maria Elvira Salazar, which was a media personality for years, and the others. There is this, and we have to take this seriously. I'm not saying that it's going to happen, but I'm saying that at the very least it's there as an idea. But it's not only Trump talking about this, which, by the way, have been talking about this somewhat consistently. This beyond that, I just mentioned this account in X. This account went even further. This is the one who published a map of US and annexing Canada, Greenland, Panama Canal, out of Mexico, Nicaragua, Cuba, Dominican Republic. I'm serious about it. Look for it. So it is not only Trump, it could be worse. And then in that context, Biden announced 3 days ago, few changes, taking Cuba out of the states that sponsor terrorism, and suspending Title III of the Hart-Burton Act, which probably will mean nothing, because those will have to be implemented by the next administration, and they even have the ability to refuse to implement them. So it could happen, sure. Or it could be repealed right away, or it could take, I don't know, a few months to reverse it. But at this point, given all of this, what it looks like, the probability is that situation will go worse. If possible, it will go worse. So I would like to leave you in a more optimistic note, but I just can't. I just can't.
Thank you very much, Professor Dominguez. I have been asked to moderate the conversation. We have something like a half hour. As usual, our students have the priority to ask questions. I would also like to preface this portion of our meeting today by sharing that Professor Dominguez is teaching a class called Populism in the Americas in the spring quarter. So keep that on your radar, those of you who are taking classes. And so we're happy to field any questions.
Who breaks the ice?
So I have one, well, I guess two, but the main one is, I think for context, especially when we talk about the Cuban American population in Florida, that are, at least the majority, tend to be very Republican or against anything that resembles communism or socialism in Cuba. I think with that and with the US system in general, there comes like a bias of how we read like Cuba history or like relationships and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my concern is with being impartial, right? Because I know that there's probably propaganda from both sides, from both sides of that, right? And the government itself. So I guess how can we, at least as American citizens, but also as you know, Latin Americans in general, how can we be impartial while reading all these different things, right? I think, for instance, I'm just thinking about like maybe Che Guevara, that for some is considered like a hero, but for some is considered a mass murderer. And I guess that's my question really, like, and my concern too. How can we be impartial?
Okay. You had another question, or is just that one?
And I guess the second one is just really to maybe know a little bit more about the economic embargo or the blockade.
No more. What?
Yeah, but like specifically, like I think that's been crucial on how it gets this rhetoric, right? Of like Cuba is a failed government, they are not feeding their people. But in itself is also like a self-fulfilling prophecy because it was caused mainly by that. You touch upon a little bit about the dependency that it created at the beginning, and hence. But I think in a way they're related to it, right? And how we think about Cuba, and how it is today. Yeah.
Sure. I'm gonna answer and then we'll pick up on one. Okay. How to be impartial. There is something that's important to understand. Being impartial doesn't mean being neutral. Being impartial means essentially making your mind based on evidence, based on strong arguments and logic, not on pre-existing biases. That is extremely important to understand because often, especially when you look at CNN, that kind of media, they understand impartiality as equivalent to neutrality, and you have to give the same space and the same kind of value to every position, regardless of how valid they are, right? That is extremely important. Another thing that I think is important to understand is that definitely there will be always a huge noise around it, because of the number of people that are biased, people that have an agenda, media and institutions that have an agenda, and they work according to that agenda. So the only way to actually work in that sense is try again to look at the facts. And how to get the facts? Numbers are very seldom lie. And of course, I will suggest to compare and contrast the different sources, pretty much in the way in which historian works. Because you have different sources, you contrast and you compare them, and you apply your skepticism and your ability to reason on that, and the logic of all of that. And then you may arrive to a conclusion that will bring you closer to understanding what is going on. But then you cannot avoid, which is you have what, for example, I simply call his moral philosophy. You have in your life a preferred set of goals for any social development. Whether you are aware of that or not, you have preferences. So that will always be your already existing bias, if you want. So you have to be first of all aware of that, and being honest with yourself about that. So those would be the ways to do it. And always know what is that source, where it comes from, what it represents, what its goal. Okay? Because I just show you a table. I'm not saying that they're always lying. I'm just saying that there is an intention, there is an agenda behind these people. So you cannot take whatever they say face value. Because you cannot take whatever the Cuban government says face value, and I understand that, obviously. You cannot take what any government in the world tells you face value, but they have an interest, of course. But that doesn't mean that whoever is in the other camp or is criticizing doesn't have an agenda. That may be even a worse agenda, if you ask me. So the way to operate, if I would say, that's what I do, obviously, on a daily basis, although I have to recognize I'm Cuban, so I experience these things. Cuban who lives in Cuba, so I experience these things personally. I have lived on these conditions for, not all of that time, I'm not that old, but for a large part of that time. I was born in 1976, so I grew up in these conditions, and I experienced the special period, all of it, all enough as to understand. And I'm here now, but my family is there now, and I'm gonna be back. So everything that is going on, I experienced it just before I came. I'm informed about that. I'm gonna be living there again. So my point is I already have a bias. But what I try to do is try to look at the facts and try to examine them as objectively as possible. That's what I'm saying. That's connecting to the second question about the blockade and all of that. That's why I have to say that the blockade, doesn't matter how you look at it, is the biggest problem for the development of Cuba, full stop, or period. Why? What does the blockade actually mean? It means trying to deny Cuba access to essentially anything. Any third country-based company that is doing this with Cuba could be punished. If that company doesn't have any sort of interest in the United States, doesn't have any kind of business in the United States, that company may do it. But how many companies that could operate in Cuba would not have some degree of connection with the United States? And then the bank that may fund these operations will almost certainly have a connection with the United States, and so on and so forth. There's a multi-layer thing. And this has been one of its, it's not about one revolution itself, it's like a huge entanglement. By the way, we're talking about this, we are planning a workshop to go deeper in these things, what actually represents the blockade or the sanctions against Cuba, and also against Venezuela, by the way, in a couple of months from now. So I hope you can all attend, just plugging in as well. But it's a space that you can actually use to go deeper in this sense. But definitely, the blockade is the bigger thing that it is have been developed since 1959. That means that you have the application of the Trade with the Enemy Act of 1917, the only country to which it is applied as of now by the United States, is Cuba. There's another regulation from 1949 that was also applied in the context to apply that actually gave the president the legal right to impose those sanctions against you. And then you have the two from there can the Cuban Asset Regulation, essentially in OFAC, essentially tracks and punishes anything Cuba related around. And Cuba was banned from using the dollar, so it is extremely complicated for Cuba to use it. The Cuba is not part of SWIFT, Cuba is not part of the visa system when the United States is involved, so on and so forth. So anything that you may do, like even casually here, you cannot do it in Cuba, like, pay with your card from here, go to Cuba, cannot use it. If you organize a GoFundMe, a crowdfunding, and trying to support someone in Cuba or to send aid to Cubans in disaster, it will not work. Not in that way. You have to find sometimes not completely legal way for the United States way to do it because of that. And those are just a few hints.
The ramifications really go far and wide. Do you have a question, Claudia?
Yeah, I guess my overarching question is why Cuba? Because when I'm thinking historically, there were other countries that also didn't necessarily fit within the US power structure, especially during the Cold War. And obviously we altered the histories of those countries too, but I'm thinking like Guatemala, Nicaragua, I think also Panama with the canal. But I think like this consistent pressure towards Cuba with the embargo and kind of blockade and exclusion, where I feel like the relationship between other Latin American nations have changed. Is it because maybe, I remember you mentioned like the connection with other elites, so that, but also is it because it was a colony and then it won its sovereignty? Is that like a difference, or just your thoughts around that?
We can take another one if you want.
Yes, sure. Let me actually ask a question from the chats on YouTube.
Okay.
This is from Christian Raúl Baez, our dissertation completion fellow. It says, thanks, Ernesto, for the presentation. Lifting sanctions on Cuba is certainly an urgent matter, but I wonder what are the domestic policy tools that the Cuban government has now to alleviate the economic crisis? Would you like to take another one, or two is plenty?
We can take another one.
And then that would be Peter, I believe.
Thank you first off for your great presentation, super interesting, super illuminating. I want to pick up on two brief threads from the presentation. One, when you pointed out the inflection point of, I believe, 1897, the Cuban-American War, Spanish-American War, as an inflection point wherein the United States turns into active empire building, and then also, or a potential inflection point, right? And another thing you talked about, this idea of global decline of US hegemony. Maybe in the future, we'll be able to look back at certain recent inflection points, whether it's the Iraq War, whether it's Palestine, whether it's something that hasn't happened yet or is ongoing, as an inflection, as other inflection points about the decline of US hegemony. But in that regard, I mean, obviously you can't tell the future. Obviously, that's a game that we're never going to win. But in terms of looking ahead in the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, another thing we see a lot with declining empires is they tend to lash out. They tend to tighten their grip on the things that they have to prevent them from slipping away. Maybe we could read the doubling down or the tripling down and continue the embargo in that way. Could you foresee a point at which, even as the US embargo tightens or whatever, that it doesn't matter as much anymore because US global hegemony is lower? I read recently that I think China and Cuba have partnering up to build some sort of like wind farm or solar panels in Cuba, stuff like that. Could you see stuff like that happening more and more in the coming years and decades as US hegemony declines? Or is that something that's too kind of because of Cuba being in America's backyard is too
Surround
too hard to imagine?
Let's put it in the surroundings, around the United States, because backyard, front yard implies something
That's true.
nasty. Okay, well, the first question, there have been other processes in Latin America in which there have been attempts, more or less successful, of breaking with the United States, and often there have been a very strong opposition from the local elites to those processes because of other things. One reason why the Cuban Revolution actually was, or is still more successful than essentially any other revolution in the region, at the very least in the last 70 years or so, because it successfully took the elites out of the equation within Cuba. Why I'm saying this? Because the elites in Latin America, until now, are very much connected and like junior partners of this power structure. They benefit from that. The owners of the sugar in Cuba sold their sugar in the United States. They have their power position within Cuba largely because they were supported by the United States itself. So there is those are so intertwined that you cannot have one with the other. That's why business sovereignty included the necessity of changing that social structure. How to change it, that's another question. But you have to change it in order to actually acquire sovereignty. And that applies essentially to anyone in Latin America. In most cases in Latin America, when they have some attempts, those attempts have been crushed. Guatemala, you mentioned, 1954, Jacobo Arbenz. In order for a company, the CIA collided to overthrow Jacobo Arbenz, democratically elected, according to the rules of the game in place. Nicaragua, 1979, the revolution, whatever. It is backing government, yes, but they were the target of, they actually suffered a 10 years, 11 years long civil war. So when the contrast, the opposition was directly supported by the United States. Remember, there was a very famous scandal, the Iran-Contra scandal during the Reagan administration, because of the way in which they sold weapons to Iran to fund the support for the Nicaraguan Contras, in spite of prohibition by Congress. And you can actually see, and of course, Chile, 1973, the coup supported by the US, and you can actually go all along the list of the countries that have tried this and how they have been treated, have been the US reaction and the role of the elites. And you can see it even now in a number of countries have attempted to go through a different path, to take a different path, and you see how the localists, both those governments actively and how they actually ally themselves to the United States, or they keep the alliance with the United States as a major part of that opposition. So that's in a nutshell, that's the answer that I can give to the question of that. Is what exactly what you that helps you. But then about the tools, the policy tools within Cuba, it's extremely hard to figure out what the Cuban government can do. There is a major reason for that. Any time that the Cuban government tries something, and if that something is somewhat successful, there will be a sanction after that. It will be targeted. That's why, by the way, not only the only reason, but a very important reason why transparency is not something that common in Cuba. That can be misused, or can be used to hide things. For sure, it has been used and misused to hide stuff. I mean, corruption, etc., etc. But transparency is one of the first, if not the first, victim of the blockade. Because every time you try something and you are open about it, and you try to be transparent about it, it will be targeted right away. So in that context, it's extremely difficult to find a policy tool. The Cuban government have tried economic reform, trying to stimulate local individual initiative, some local developments, and so on and so forth. But all of those new businesses, for example, emerging in Cuba, that have had the social consequences that I mentioned. It's not the only reason for inequality, but it's a major reason for inequality. They operate in the same context. So they are limited in what they can do. They are also targeted by the sanctions, whether openly or not. For example, if American citizens that are not of Cuban origin cannot travel to Cuba for tourism, that means that there's a potential set of consumers, which have been estimated somewhere between 3.55 million tourists per year as the potential of the American market for Cuban tourism. You cannot count on those. Those will not go to your place and buy and spend money, and you will not make money of that, and the economy will not revitalize based on that. So what the Cubans have been doing is trying, on the one hand, to find ways to stimulate the growth of the economy, trying to figure out, and that kind of is the second question, by the way, trying to figure out how or what or who could be an ally, a partner, counterpart for economic development and also for political support worldwide, and trying to figure out what to generate the ability to distribute whatever we have as efficiently as possible, addressing the main issues at hand. For many years, you have was successful in doing that to a degree that is actually made the impact of the blockade and the sanctions of that less visible to outsiders. When you look at the educational achievements, to the health achievement of Cuba, the health indicators, et cetera, but at some point, the resources are so limited that now we are also losing ground in those areas. So it is really hard to figure out what to do internally on our own that doesn't entail a total or a significant change in the international relations of the country. And that connects to the idea of these inflection points. By the way, what I said about 1898 is not that the US started to be an empire, it's that it changed the type of empire, if you want. From a more traditional territorial empire, like in the first half of the 19th century, to this more modern empire that it built after 1898 by acquiring territories and expanding its influence and so on and so forth. The reason what I'm talking about this decline is that now there are a group of countries, we may like them or not, that's not the point, that are capable and willing to operate worldwide and have an influence worldwide without the support of the United States and even against the will of the United States. And thinking about China, first and foremost, but the bloc of allies that have been built that is changing the global power dynamics. In that context, for Cuba, if it's trying to keep its position, keeping its sovereignty, its independence, especially regarding the United States, which is the biggest threat for Cuba's sovereignty, there's no way around that, it will have to find an understanding with these actors. You have now, just last year, joined BRICS. So that offers a potential, but it's just a potential for the moment. A potential for what? For economic recovery, trade without the dollar, potential investment in infrastructure, technology, and so on. But this alliance is not based on common ideological goals or whatever. It's based on common interest. So it is a little more difficult to navigate than the alliance with the Soviet Union at some point. Even when, of course, geopolitics is a big factor in it. What Cuba has to offer to BRICS is mostly geopolitical in nature. It's not like Indonesia joining BRICS, for example. Just to make the comparison, okay? So that's regarding an inflection point for this ongoing process. Inflection points are just something that we look at this, oh, here we can see the change. It's not the change itself, because 1898 was not 1898. All the Gilded Age left brought the United States to that point, for example. The massive growth of US industry, the massive growth accumulation of US capitals, and so on and so forth. Okay? So the change now is deep and is as profound as industrialization itself. The power dynamic is changing because the global political economy is changing and have changed significantly. High-tech industries, the global value chains have changed, etc., etc. So we have to look at that. Probably the 2008 crisis, if you want to point at a moment as an inflection point, maybe. We have to see. Not history, historians will say.
We have all of 4 minutes,
Oh.
but I'd like to make time for 2 quick questions and 2 quick answers if possible.
Okay.
Where people have to stampede out of the room. And I know that Brandon is being patiently waiting. And so has David. And any other question?
I'll wait.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay. So you briefly mentioned that a lot of the immigration from Cuba has been going through Mexico.
Mhm.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but is there not like temporary protective status for Cubans going directly to the United States? And why would people decide to go through Mexico and then migrate that way instead?
Well, that was my second question, so I'm glad that you asked that one. Thank you for your presentation, Prof. And my question was more, I know historians might not like to speculate too much, but like, I was wondering how you feel about Marco Rubio. You mentioned that a little bit, but like, what do you think his agenda as Secretary of State? And maybe what we can do as like Latinos or as people living in the United States regarding that.
Okay, regarding the status of Cuban immigrants, there is something that's called the the Cuban Adjustment Act, that when a Cuban person is in the United States entered legally, after a year and a day, the person can apply for legal permanent residency. That's still in place. The problem is the entry part. For a long time, Cubans were received in the United States almost automatically as political refugees. That is no longer the case, not officially. So they have to go through, there are a lot of different experiences in the case. Some people have been allowed in almost right away, so they have to go through the legal process. It depends on how they manage to present themselves, if they have the ability to demonstrate credible fear of coming back. There is a broad spectrum of ways, but it's no longer automatic as it essentially was for many, many years, because some of the regulations regarding that in particular were lifted. For example, the wet food, dry food policy that was implemented by Bill Clinton in 1995, that essentially said that any Cuban who made it to the United States soil with dried feet, not someone who will be intercepted in high seas, will be taken in as a refugee, whereas someone who will be intercepted at the sea will be returned to Cuba. There is even this idea that dry feet or dry foot meant the water below the knee or something like that. That's literally the case, that people will jump from whatever craft or whatever boat that have carried them to US shores and trying to run for the shore just to get to the shore before they'll be intercepted when the water low enough to be considered dry feet. It's kind of crazy, but that's how it works. Now it's more complicated, but still people keep coming. And Cuba then get the parole a couple years back, part of the parole program, the parole program. People, the humanitarian parole, they call it, for Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, and Venezuela. Not random countries. So it is not exactly like that anymore. And then the Marco Rubio's agenda hurt the Cuban government and by considering the Cuban people as much as possible, reinforce the blockade, keep the support of these people in Florida, these religious supporters in Florida, and in the meantime, connected to the private question, make war on China. I'm saying that literally. There is a projection that the US may enter in war with China around 2030, that this administration, the projection with the new administration is taking that date closer. Yes, I'm talking about open war with China, which is GG well played. Because it is very unlikely that an all-out war between China and the United States first will not drag Russia into it, and will not evolve or devolve into nuclear war. So I hope it doesn't happen. It's just a scenario. I'm not saying that it's going to happen. Okay, I'm not in the business of predicting, but something that can be projected as a possible and somewhat likely scenario.
There are very few institutions in the United States who can have a faculty visitor from Cuba, and we're very fortunate to have you, Ernesto. I'd like to give you this gift on behalf of the Center for Latin American Studies. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. Please join us on January 24th at 1:30 p.m. for our next Friday lecture. We're going to have a visiting thinker professor from Mexico, Sergio Ugalde, standing right there, give a talk in Spanish called Literatura y Antifascismo, Efraín Huerta, José Revueltas y Pablo Neruda en el diario El Popular de 1939 a 1943. And it just occurred to me, the students in this class, because this is a class and a speaker series, have the benefit of having some preparatory readings. So we had an article by Ernesto today. If anyone would like preparatory readings, also in Spanish, for Professor Ugalde's talk, please send us an email Joaquin, and we might also make that available. Thanks, everyone.
No, I'm not okay.
By the way, that book is only $135.
Yeah.